You know those moments in life when something so absurd happens that you're convinced you must be dreaming. That's exactly what I thought when I opened that certified letter last spring. There I was, standing in our farmhouse kitchen, coffee in hand, staring at a document claiming our family owed $70,000 in unpaid HOA dues for our farm. A farm that's been in my family for 3 decades. Here's the real kicker. We've never been part of any HOA. In fact, when I called the county office to tell them there must be some mistake, they informed me this mysterious Valley Estates HOA had already initiated foreclosure proceedings on our property. My whole world stopped spinning in that moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me paint you a picture of what we're talking about here. Our farm isn't some small backyard garden. It's 85 acres of rolling hills in western Montana, with fields of wheat that turn golden every August, just like they have since my father first bought this land in 1993. We've got a red barn that my brothers and I repainted every few years growing up, a silo that's probably older than most suburban developments in the area, and a farmhouse that's seen 4 generations of my family gather around its dinner table. The absurdity of an HOA trying to claim authority over a working farm would be laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. I mean, what were they going to do? Fine us because our tractors don't match the approved color scheme? Tell us our cattle need to file for architectural review? But as ridiculous as it sounds, this wasn't a joke. This was very real, and it was about to turn into the fight of our lives. I remember calling my dad, who's now retired, but still lives in the old farmhouse with Mom. He's not a man who gets rattled easily. You can't be when you've spent 40 years dealing with droughts, early frosts, and fluctuating crop prices. But when I told him about the HOA claim, there was a long silence on the phone. Then he said something that sent chills down my spine. "Sarah, check the date on that letter again." The letter was dated March 15th, 2024, exactly 30 years to the day since we'd bought the farm. That couldn't be a coincidence. Someone had been planning this, waiting for this exact moment. But who? And why? That's when I started digging into this Valley Estates HOA. According to their letterhead, they were supposedly managing an upscale community in our area, except there was no Valley Estates anywhere near us. The only Pine Valley I knew of was an old logging camp that had been abandoned back in the 80s, a good 5 miles from our property line. The deeper I looked, the stranger things got. The HOA claimed we'd been members since 1994, just 1 year after my parents bought the farm. They had documents, registration numbers, even board meeting minutes mentioning our property. On paper, it all looked legitimate, but we'd never signed anything, never received any notices before this, never even heard of them until that letter arrived. And then there was the money, $70,000. They'd broken it down year by year, annual dues, late fees, compound interest, even fines for violations of community guidelines we'd never known existed. They claimed our grain silos exceeded their height restrictions, that our farm equipment storage violated their aesthetic standards, that our property hadn't maintained the resort-style character of the community. I've heard stories about aggressive HOAs before. Everyone has. But this was different. This wasn't about someone's fence color or unmowed lawn. This was about something bigger. Someone had spent 30 years building an elaborate paper trail, creating a fake HOA from scratch, just waiting for the right moment to try and take our farm. The question was, why? Why target a family farm that had been peacefully operating for 3 decades? Why go through the trouble of creating such an elaborate scheme? And most importantly, who was behind it all? I didn't know it then, but finding answers to these questions would uncover a conspiracy bigger than anything I could have imagined, one that stretched back decades and involved some of the most prominent figures in our community. What started as a shocking letter would turn into a 2-year battle that would test our family's resilience, expose a web of corruption, and ultimately teach me that sometimes the greatest threats don't come from natural disasters or market crashes, but from the quiet machinations of people you thought you could trust. This is the story of how we fought back against a phantom HOA, uncovered a decades-long fraud, and saved not just our farm, but our entire community from a scheme that had been 30 years in the making. To understand why this farm means everything to us, you need to know how we got here. Back in 1993, my father, Michael Richardson, wasn't looking to become a farmer. He was a high school science teacher in Billings, making ends meet while my mom worked as a nurse. They had 3 kids to feed, me, my older brother James, and my younger brother Tommy. We were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, and the idea of owning any property, let alone a farm, seemed like an impossible dream. But then my grandfather passed away. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he'd invested in some mining stocks back in the 70s that turned out to be worth something. He left each of his children a modest inheritance. Most of my aunts and uncles used the money for new cars or down payments on suburban homes. But my dad had a different vision. He'd grown up hearing stories about his own grandfather's farm in Minnesota, lost during the Great Depression. Those stories had stuck with him. Tales of early morning harvests, family working together, and the satisfaction of growing something with your own hands. So when he saw the listing for this old farm outside of Pine Creek, Montana, something clicked. I remember the first time we drove out to see it. It was April 1993, and the previous owner, old Jack Murphy, was waiting for us at the gate. The farm had seen better days. The fence posts were leaning, the barn needed a new roof, and the fields hadn't been properly tended in years. But Dad saw something in this place that the rest of us couldn't see yet. Old Jack had owned the farm since the 60s, but his kids had moved away to Seattle and wanted nothing to do with farming. His wife had passed the year before, and at 78 he couldn't manage it alone anymore. He could have sold to one of the big agricultural corporations that were buying up family farms in the area. Riverside Ag Solutions had offered him well above market value, but Jack wanted the farm to go to a family, someone who'd worked the land themselves, rather than turn it into another corporate operation. When Dad told Jack about his grandfather's farm and his dream of giving his own kids the life he never had, something changed in the old man's expression. He took us on a tour that lasted hours, showing us every corner of the property. He pointed out the ancient apple trees his wife had planted, the spring-fed creek that never ran dry even in drought years, and the high point where you could see all the way to the mountains on a clear day. The price was more than Dad's inheritance, but Jack offered to own a finance part of it. I'd rather see a family make this work than take more money from some corporation, he said. He even spent that first summer teaching Dad everything he knew about farming, when to plant, how to maintain the equipment, which fields needed extra attention. Those early years weren't easy. Mum kept her nursing job in town, working night shifts while Dad split his time between teaching and learning to farm. My brothers and I went from being city kids to farm kids overnight. Instead of sleeping in on weekends, we were up at dawn, helping with chores. Our summer vacations became harvest seasons, but something amazing happened during those years. The farm changed us. We learned the value of hard work, the importance of family pulling together. That rusty old tractor became our teacher. Those endless rows of wheat our classroom. Every harvest was a lesson in patience and perseverance. Every broken fence was an opportunity to learn problem-solving. The farmhouse itself became the heart of our family. The kitchen where Mum would can vegetables from her garden, the living room where we'd collapse after long days in the fields, the front porch where Dad would sit with old Jack, soaking up farming wisdom until Jack passed away in '96. Even the creaky stairs and drafty windows became part of our story. I remember the day we finally paid off the farm loan in 2008. Dad gathered us all in the kitchen, just like he had that first morning in '93. He took out the original deed and laid it on the table. "This isn't just a piece of paper," he said. "This is our family's legacy. Everything we've built here, everything we've learned, it's all in this deed. This farm isn't just land, it's who we are." That's what makes this HOA situation so infuriating. They're not just threatening a piece of property, they're threatening 30 years of family history. Every fence post we mended, every crop we harvested, every memory we made. They're trying to put a price tag on it all and call it $70,000 in unpaid dues. But what they don't understand is that this farm isn't just an asset on some balance sheet. It's where I learned to drive on old dirt roads, where my brother James proposed to his wife under those apple trees old Jack's wife planted, where my nephew took his first steps on the same porch where we used to listen to Jack's farming stories. You can't put a price on that kind of history. When I look out at our fields now, I don't just see wheat or profits. I see 30 years of sunrise breakfasts and midnight repairs, of family celebrations and shared struggles. This land doesn't just belong to us on paper, it's part of who we are. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let some phantom HOA try to take that away. After that first shocking letter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the absurdity of an HOA claiming authority over a working farm. It was the precision of it all. The timing, the amount, even the way the letter was worded felt calculated. I spent that entire morning reading and rereading every line, looking for some explanation that would make this make sense. The letter itself was printed on expensive letterhead, Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association, in raised gold. Lettering with a logo showing pine trees around a pristine lake. It looked professional, official even, but there was no lake anywhere near Pine Valley, and the only pine trees in the area had been logged out decades ago. I called my brother James first. As a real estate attorney in Bozeman, he'd dealt with his fair share of HOA disputes. When I told him about the letter, he laughed initially, just like I had. An HOA trying to claim jurisdiction over active farmland? "That's got to be a joke," he said. But when I texted him photos of the documentation they'd included, his tone changed completely. "Sarah, this is thorough," he said after a long pause. "They've got parcel numbers, county records references, even documentation of supposed violations. Going back to the '90s, someone put a lot of work into this." He promised to look into it more deeply, but his concern only amplified my own unease. The packet they'd sent included what looked like annual assessment notices dating back to 1994. Each one detailed supposed violations of community guidelines. Our grain silos exceeding height restrictions, unauthorized agricultural equipment visible from community roadways, failure to maintain resort-style landscaping standards. They'd even included photos, dated and time-stamped, showing our tractors, combines and other farm equipment that supposedly violated their regulations. The most bizarre part was a section about our livestock. According to their community guidelines, all animals had to be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. They claimed we'd been operating an unauthorized agricultural business and had never submitted the required forms for our cattle, chickens, or workhorses. There were even specific violations listed for our barn cats. Apparently, they exceeded the 2-pet maximum per household rule. I found myself getting angrier with each page. These people, whoever they were, hadn't just created fake HOA documents. And they'd been watching our farm, photographing our property, documenting every aspect of our operations. The violation notices included details that could only have come from someone who'd been paying very close attention to our farm for years. Preparing. And narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The financial breakdown was even more infuriating. They started with base HOA dues of $250 per month in 1994, with annual increases of 5%. Then came the violation fees, $500 for each unauthorized piece of farm equipment, $1,000 per unapproved livestock category, $750 per month for commercial agricultural activity without proper permits. They'd added late fees, interest charges, and administrative processing fees for each violation. The total somehow came to exactly $70,000, a suspiciously round number for something supposedly calculated over 30 years. My mum called while I was still going through the paperwork. She'd been crying, I could tell. "Honey, your father's not doing well with this," she said. "He keeps going through all our old documents, trying to figure out how this could have happened. He barely slept. Last night." Dad had already been dealing with health issues. His blood pressure had been a concern lately, and this kind of stress was the last thing he needed. I decided to drive out to the farm that afternoon. As I turned onto our access road, something caught my eye that I'd never noticed before. There was a small, weathered sign, partially hidden in the brush near our property line. It looked old, maybe 20 or 30 years old, but something about it seemed off. I pulled over to take a closer look. The sign was designed to look aged, but the material was wrong. It was made to appear like it had been there for decades, but the composite material it was made from hadn't even been in common use until recently. In faded letters it read, "Pine Valley Estates, a planned community." Below that was a line that made my blood run cold. Established 1994. Someone had gone to the trouble of manufacturing and artificially aging a fake HOA sign, then placing it near our property line where it wouldn't be easily noticed. How long had it been there? How many other signs like this might be scattered around our property? The level of planning and deception was staggering. I took photos of the sign and sent them to James. His response came back almost immediately. "Don't remove it. Document everything. Someone's been playing a very long game here." He was right. This wasn't some simple scam. The fake sign, the detailed documentation, the exact timing of the letter. Someone had spent years setting this up, carefully, laying the groundwork for this moment. As I drove up to my parents' house, I could see Dad out in the field, walking the property line like he had so many times before. But this time was different. He wasn't checking fences or surveying crops. He was looking for more signs, more evidence of this invisible HOA that had suddenly materialized to threaten everything we'd built. I parked next to Mum's car and sat there for a moment watching him. In the late afternoon light, he looked older somehow, weighed down by this new burden. That's when I made a decision. Whoever was behind this wasn't just going to get away with it. They might have spent years planning this scheme, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know the Richardsons. The next morning, I decided to take action. My brother James had advised gathering official documentation before doing anything else, so I headed to the Pine Creek County Records Office as soon as they opened. The building was one of those typical small-town government offices, fluorescent lights, worn linoleum floors, and the smell of old paper and coffee. The clerk at the front desk, Mrs. Henderson, had worked there for as long as anyone could remember. She'd actually helped process our original property purchase back in '93, so I thought she might remember something useful. When I explained why I was there, her usual friendly smile faded. "Pine Valley Estates," she said, frowning at her computer screen. "That's strange. I'm showing an active HOA registration for that development, but—" She trailed off, clicking through several screens. "This doesn't make any sense. The digital records show it was established in 1994, but I don't remember processing any of this paperwork." She dug deeper into the system, her frown deepening. According to this, Pine Valley Estates encompasses over 500 acres, including your family's farm and several other properties in the area. But these records... She paused again, squinting at the screen. They're marked as being digitized from original documents, but something's off about the formatting. I leaned over to look at her screen. The documents did look official at first. Glance, lot numbers, property descriptions, HOA covenants, all properly formatted. But Mrs. Henderson was right. The spacing was inconsistent, and some of the fonts didn't quite match the county's standard templates from that era. "Let me check the physical records," she said, pushing back from her desk. "We keep everything from before 2000 in the basement archives." She disappeared down a narrow stairway, leaving me to pace nervously in the fluorescent-lit waiting area. 20 minutes later, she returned, looking disturbed. "Sarah, we have a problem," she said, laying out several folders on the counter. "I found the original property records for your farm and all the surrounding parcels from the 90s. None of them mention Pine Valley Estates or any HOA. But..." She pulled out another set of documents, these ones crisper and newer looking. "These appeared in our files sometime in the last few years. They're backdated to 1994, but the paper stock is wrong. It's too new." My heart was pounding. "Someone inserted fake documents into the county records?" Mrs. Henderson nodded grimly. "And they did a professional job of it. These aren't just photocopies. They're properly formatted legal documents with official-looking seals. Someone with knowledge of county records and access to the right materials created these." She pulled out one document in particular, a supposed HOA registration form from 1994. "Look at this signature," she said, pointing to the bottom. "It's supposed to be from Thomas Walker, who was the county clerk back then. But Tom had a very distinctive signature, and this isn't it. I worked with him for 15 years. I'd know his signature anywhere." The implications were staggering. Someone hadn't just created a fake HOA, they'd managed to insert fraudulent documents into official county records. This wasn't some simple scam. It was sophisticated fraud that required inside knowledge and access. "There's more," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I checked the access logs for our digital system. Someone's been systematically adding and modifying records related to Pine Valley Estates over the past 5 years. Small changes, nothing that would trigger immediate attention. But when you look at it all together..." She showed me the log entries. There were hundreds of them, each making tiny modifications to property records, tax assessments, and zoning documents, all building a paper trail to make it look like this HOA had existed for decades. "The thing is," she continued, "these changes were made using valid administrative credentials. Someone either has unauthorized access to our system or..." She hesitated. "Or someone inside the county government is involved." That's when another county employee walked past, and Mrs. Henderson quickly gathered up the documents. "Listen," she said quietly, "I shouldn't be showing you all this, but I've known your family for years, and something very wrong is happening here. Be careful who you talk to about this, even within the county offices. I'll make copies of everything I found, but..." She glanced around nervously. "Maybe we should arrange to meet somewhere else to discuss this further." I understood her concern. If someone with access to county records was involved in this scheme, the records office itself might not be safe to have these conversations. We arranged to meet at a small diner on the outskirts of town later that day. As I left the county building, my mind was racing. This wasn't just about someone trying to extort money from my family. This was systematic fraud that potentially implicated county officials. The fake HOA was just the tip of the iceberg. But who had the expertise, access, and motivation to orchestrate something this elaborate? I called James from my car and filled him in on what I'd found. "This is bigger than we thought," he said after a long pause. "Much bigger. We need to be very careful how we proceed. If there are corrupt officials involved, they might have access to more than just county records. He was right. We needed to think strategically, but first I had to meet Mrs. Henderson and get those documents. Little did I know, someone else was very interested in that meeting too, someone who'd been watching more closely than we realized. Before meeting with Mrs. Henderson, I drove back to the farm to update my parents and gather any documentation. I found Mum and Dad sitting at the kitchen table with boxes of old papers spread out everywhere. Dad looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept at all. He was still wearing the same clothes from yesterday. "Look at this," he said, as soon as I walked in, holding up our original property deed from 1993. "I've gone through every piece of paper we signed when we bought this place. There's nothing about an HOA, not one mention of Valley Estates." He shuffled through more documents, tax assessments, insurance papers, utility bills. 30 years of paperwork, and not a single reference to any homeowners association. Mom was going through another box, this one containing old Jack Murphy's papers that he'd left us before he passed. "Jack kept meticulous records," she said. "He documented everything about this farm going back to the 60s. If there had been an HOA, he would have known about it." I sat down with them and shared what I'd learned at the county records office. As I explained about the fraudulent documents and potentially corrupt officials, Dad's face grew increasingly pale. Mum reached over and grabbed his hand. I could see them both thinking about what we were up against. "There's something else," Dad said after a moment. He pulled out an old leather-bound notebook, Jack's farming journal from the early 90s. "I was reading through this last night, looking for anything that might help us understand what's going on. I found something interesting." He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded receipt. "This is from October 1993, just a few months before we bought the place. Jack writes about being approached by someone from Riverside Agricultural Solutions, that big corporate farming operation that was trying to buy up land in the area. They wanted his property badly, offered way above market value. I remembered hearing about Riverside when we first bought the farm. They'd been aggressively expanding their operations in Montana at the time." Dad continued reading from the journal. "They said if I didn't sell, the land would be worthless soon anyway. Said changes were coming to the valley that would make traditional farming impossible. I told them they could take their offer and shove it." "Changes coming to the valley?" I asked. "What did they mean by that?" Mom pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from another box. It was from the Pine Creek Gazette, dated spring 1994, right around when this fake HOA was supposedly established. The headline read, "County approves controversial rezoning measure." "I remember this," she said. "There was a big debate about rezoning parts of the valley for planned development. A lot of farmers were worried it would lead to their properties being surrounded by subdivisions. But the measure only passed partially. Most of the agricultural areas, including our section, kept their original zoning." Dad nodded slowly. What if someone's been playing the long game here? What if this fake HOA isn't just about money? What if it's about the land itself? Just then, my brother James called. I put him on speaker and caught him up on what we'd found. He was silent for a moment before speaking. "You know what's interesting about all this? The timing. That HOA was supposedly established in 1994, right after the rezoning attempt failed. And now they're moving to foreclose exactly 30 years later, just when the statute of limitations on certain types of property fraud might be about to expire." "But why wait so long?" Mom asked. "Property values," James replied. "Have you seen what farmland around Pine Creek is going for these days? With all the tech companies moving into Montana and people buying up rural property, agricultural land that can be rezoned for development is worth 10 times what it was in the 90s. Dad suddenly stood up and walked to the window, staring out at our fields. "Jack knew," he said quietly. "He knew someone was trying to force farmers out. That's why he was so insistent on selling to a family who'd worked the land themselves. He thought that would protect it. My phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Henderson. "Can't make meeting. Something's come up. Be careful. Someone asking questions." "About you pulling records today." A chill ran down my spine. I showed the text to everyone at the table. James spoke up first. "Sarah, I'm coming out there. Don't do anything else until I arrive. No more record searches, no more questions. We need to be smart about this." "He's right," Dad said, still looking out the window. "Whoever's behind this has been planning it for decades. They're not going to give up easily just because we're asking questions." Mum started gathering up the documents, organizing them carefully. "We need to make copies of everything," she said. "Keep them somewhere safe, away from the farm." I walked over to join Dad at the window. A truck I didn't recognize was driving slowly past our property, the driver clearly looking at our fields. Dad noticed it too. "They're watching us," he said softly. "They probably have been for years. We just never noticed." Looking out at our land, the wheat fields golden in the afternoon sun, the old barn standing proud against the Montana sky, I felt a mix of anger and determination. This farm wasn't just some investment property to be traded away. It was our home, our legacy, our life's work, and we were going to fight for it. But first, we needed to understand exactly what we were fighting against. Because somewhere in these boxes of documents, somewhere in the county records, somewhere in old Jack's journals, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. We just had to find it before they found us. That evening, James arrived from Bozeman with a stack of legal documents and a grim expression. He'd barely set his briefcase down when another letter arrived. This one delivered by courier rather than regular mail. The envelope was marked "Urgent. Valley Estates HOA Notice of Immediate Action." Inside was a document that made our previous concerns seem almost trivial. Not only were they moving forward with the foreclosure, but they'd also filed an emergency injunction to prevent us from continuing any agricultural activities on the property. According to their filing, our unauthorized commercial farming operations posed an immediate threat to community standards and property values. The letter went on to detail how we had 72 hours to cease all farming operations or face additional daily fines of $1,000. They'd even included a list of specific demands: immediate removal of all agricultural equipment from public view, cessation of all livestock operations, and the dismantling of our grain silos, which they claimed violated their height restrictions. "This is insane," James said, reviewing the documents. "They're trying to force us to essentially destroy our own farm while the foreclosure is still being disputed. Look at these requirements. They're not just asking us to stop farming. They're demanding we dismantle infrastructure that's been here for decades." But it was the last page that really showed their hand. They'd included a settlement offer. They would withdraw all claims and fees if we agreed to sell the property to their designated development partner at 60% of its current market value. The partner's name? Riverside Valley Development LLC, a subsidiary of the same Riverside Agricultural Solutions that had tried to buy our farm back in '93. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," Dad said, his voice shaking with anger. "They're using this fake HOA to force us to sell to the very same company Jack refused to sell to 30 years ago." James spread more papers across the kitchen table. "It gets worse," he said. "I did some digging into Riverside before I drove. Out here, they've changed names and restructured multiple times over the years, but they've been buying up family farms all across Montana. And look at this pattern." He showed us a map he'd created, marking all of Riverside's acquisitions in red. A clear pattern emerged. They'd been systematically purchasing properties around Pine Creek Valley, creating a patchwork of corporate-owned land surrounding the remaining family farms. In the last 5 years alone, they've acquired over 3,000 acres in this county, James continued. Most of it from foreclosures or distressed sales. And here's the interesting part. In at least 3 cases, the sales happened after disputes with previously unknown HOAs. Mum gasped. You mean they've done this before? Similar patterns, different names. James nodded. Crystal Mountain, Estates HOA, Blue River Community Association. They all appeared out of nowhere, claimed jurisdiction over agricultural properties, and pushed for foreclosure. In each case, Riverside or one of their subsidiaries ended up with the land. Then we heard the rumble of engines outside. 3 black SUVs had pulled up to our gate. Men in suits emerged, accompanied by what looked like private security guards. One of them was carrying a camera and surveying equipment. Don't go out there, James warned as Dad started toward the door. This is a deliberate intimidation tactic. They want us to confront them, to do something they can use against us. We watched through the windows as they methodically photographed and measured our property. They paid particular attention to the grain silos and equipment yard, documenting everything. One of them even flew a drone over our fields, probably gathering more evidence of our violations. They're building their case, James explained. Every piece of farm equipment, every agricultural structure, every animal on this property. They'll use it all as evidence that we're in violation of their manufactured HOA regulations. The show of force continued for over an hour. Before leaving, they posted multiple notices on our gate and fence posts, bright orange violations notices warning of impending fines and legal action. It was a clear message. They had the resources and determination to overwhelm us. As the SUVs pulled away, Dad slumped into his chair. How do we fight this? He asked quietly. They've got money, lawyers, fake documents that look real, and apparently people inside the county government helping. Then what chance do we have? James pulled out his phone and showed us something else, a message from a colleague in the State Attorney General's office. We might have one advantage they don't know about, he said. Remember that rezoning attempt in '94 that failed? The AG's office has had an ongoing investigation into suspicious land deals in this county since then. They've never had enough evidence to move forward. But with what we've uncovered about these fake HOAs... He paused as another message came in. And there's something else. That county clerk, Mrs. Henderson, she's worked at the records office since the '80s. She would have been there during the original rezoning attempt and when these fake HOA documents started appearing. If she's willing to talk, if they haven't gotten to her already, I added, remembering her cancelled meeting and warning text. We need to move fast, James said. They're escalating because they know we're onto something. We have 72 hours before their injunction kicks in, and you can bet they'll be watching to see if we comply. We need to find Mrs. Henderson and get her to go on record about those documents before they can silence her. Looking at those orange violation notices fluttering on our fence in the evening breeze, I realized we were past the point of simple legal disputes. This was war, a war for our farm, our legacy, and the truth about what had been happening in Pine Creek Valley for the past 30 years. And somehow I knew the next 72 hours would determine everything. With time ticking on the 72-hour deadline, we needed to understand just how deep this conspiracy went in our community. James suggested we start reaching out to other farmers in the area, particularly those who'd lost their land under suspicious circumstances over the past few years. Our first stop was the Miller Dairy Farm, about 5 miles down the valley. The Millers had lost their property last year after operating it for over 40 years. At the time, everyone thought they'd simply retired and sold to a developer. But given what we now knew, I wondered if there was more to the story. We found Bob Miller working as a manager at the local farm supply store. When I mentioned Pine Valley Estates HOA, his face went white. You too? He asked, ushering us into the store's back office. I thought we were the only ones they'd gone after. Bob's story was eerily similar to ours. A sudden notice of HOA violations, Massive fines accumulating over decades and pressure to sell to a development company. They claimed we'd been part of something called Crystal Mountain Estates HOA since 1995, he explained. Said we owed them $85,000 in back dues and fines. We fought it for 6 months, spent our life savings on lawyers, but in the end, he pulled out his phone and showed us photos of his old property, where the dairy farm had once stood, was now an empty field with future site of Mountain Vista luxury homes signs posted along the road. The developer who bought it, subsidiary of Riverside, they haven't built anything, just tore down our barn and let the land sit empty. James took notes as Bob continued. The strange thing was, right before all this happened, someone from the county assessor's office came out to update our property records. Said it was routine, but they spent a lot of time taking photos and measurements. A month later, we got our first HOA notice. This was the pattern we'd suspected, county officials involved in setting up these fake HOAs. Did you ever meet anyone who claimed to be part of the HOA's leadership? I asked. Never face to face, Bob replied. Everything came through letters. Or their lawyer, some high-powered firm from Billings, but he hesitated, looking around nervously. There was someone who warned me this was coming. About a week before we got our first notice, Margaret Chen from the old Thompson place stopped by. Said we should sell while we could still get a good price, that changes were coming to the valley whether we liked it or not. The name hit me like a thunderbolt. Margaret Chen was on the County Planning Commission. She'd also been one of the biggest supporters of that failed rezoning attempt back in '94. Did she mention Riverside? I asked. Not directly, but she kept talking about progress and how small farms couldn't survive in the modern economy. Said we should be realistic about the valley's future. Bob's hands clenched into fists. 2 months later, we lost everything our family had built over 4 decades. Leaving the store, James and I decided to drive by some of the other properties Riverside had acquired. A pattern quickly emerged. Every former family farm they'd bought was sitting empty, with similar future development signs posted. No actual construction, no improvements, just demolished barns, empty fields, and waiting. They're land banking, James explained as we drove. Buying up properties but not developing them yet. They're waiting for something. He pulled over to check his phone, scrolling through property records. Look at this. They now own about 40% of the agricultural land in the valley, all acquired in the last 5 years through these suspicious foreclosures and forced sales. Our next stop was the Gunderson place. Like us, they were still holding out against development pressure. Eric Gunderson was working on his tractor when we pulled up. After hearing our story, he brought out a file of papers he'd been keeping. Started. Getting weird notices about 6 months ago, he said, showing us letters from something called Blue River Community Association. Different HOA name than yours, but same story, claiming we've owed them dues since the 90s. I've been documenting everything, figuring something fishy was going on. Eric had gone a step further than most. He'd installed security cameras after noticing unusual vehicles parking near his property. He pulled up some footage on his phone. Look familiar? The same black SUVs that had visited our farm were there conducting similar surveys of his property, but Eric had caught something else on his cameras. Late at night, people in dark clothing had been placing markers and signs around his property line, similar to the fake HOA sign we'd found. They're building their evidence, he said, creating a paper trail and physical proof of these HOAs after the fact. As we were leaving, Eric mentioned one more thing. You know what's weird? Last week, surveyors from the county were out here, talking about some major infrastructure project coming through the valley. Said they couldn't give details yet, but big changes were coming. Mentioned something about water rights and access roads. On the drive back to our farm, James was quiet, putting pieces together. Water rights, he finally said. That's what they're waiting for. If they control enough land in the valley when major infrastructure changes come through. He didn't. Need to finish the thought. In Montana, water rights were often more valuable than the land itself. If Riverside was positioning themselves to control water access in the valley, these land grabs were about much more than just real estate development. Back at the farm, we found more orange violation notices posted, these ones threatening criminal trespassing charges if we continued farming operations past the deadline. They were signed by someone claiming to be the Valley Estates HOA enforcement officer, but the signature was just an illegible scrawl. The pieces were starting to fit together, but time was running out. We had less than 48 hours before their injunction kicked in, and we still needed to find Mrs. Henderson. But now we knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just about our farm anymore. This was about the future of the entire valley. With our newfound information about the valley-wide scheme, we decided to dig deeper into the county records. James suggested we focus on the connection between Margaret Chen, the Planning Commission, and these mysterious HOAs. But with Mrs. Henderson still unreachable and possibly in danger, we needed another way into the records. That's when I remembered something old Jack had mentioned years ago. His wife Linda had worked in the county records office before Mrs. Henderson, back in the early 90s. Before she passed, she'd kept detailed journals about her work. Jack had shown them to Dad once, saying they might be important someday. We found the journals in a dusty box in our barn's loft, wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture. Linda Murphy had indeed documented everything, including some interesting notes about the 1994 rezoning attempt. According to her entries, Margaret Chen hadn't just supported the rezoning. She'd been part of a private investment group that had options to buy several properties if the rezoning passed. "Look at this," I said, pointing to an entry from March 1994. Linda wrote that Chen and her partners had already drafted plans for a massive development project. They were so confident the rezoning would pass, they'd started preparing legal documents in advance. James leaned in to read, "Today, MC brought in preliminary HOA documents for review. Strange, since no development exists yet. Said they were planning ahead." Documents included multiple HOA frameworks: Pine Valley, Crystal Mountain, Blue River, all identical except for names. TW, Thomas Walker, the then county clerk, seemed uncomfortable but processed them anyway. "They created all these HOAs back then," Dad said, "but kept them dormant until they needed them. That's why the documents in the county system looked backdated. They actually were from 1994. But they were never meant to be active unless the rezoning passed." Linda's journals revealed more. She'd noticed irregularities in how property records were being handled and had started documenting everything. There were mentions of late-night visits to the records office by planning commission members, unusual requests to access archived documents, and multiple versions of property maps being created. But the most damning entry was from April 1994, just before the rezoning vote. MC came in again today with RAS Rep. RAS, Riverside Agricultural Solutions. They were reviewing property lines and discussing future acquisition zones. When they saw me, they quickly packed up their maps. MC asked if I'd seen anything, said it was confidential planning commission business. But I saw enough. They're planning something big, and they don't want anyone to know. James was photographing every page of the journals with his phone. "This is gold," he said. Linda Murphy was documenting their whole setup, probably without even realizing what she was seeing. No wonder old Jack held on to these journals. The next entry made my blood run cold. Linda wrote about overhearing a conversation between Chen and the Riverside rep. They discussed contingency plans if rezoning failed, said they might need to take alternative approaches to land acquisition, mentioned something about delayed. Implementation and administrative solutions. Whatever they're planning, they're prepared to wait years if necessary. 30 years, Dad said quietly. They've been waiting 30 years to execute this plan. As we continued reading, another name kept appearing. Benjamin Drake, a junior clerk in the records office at the time. According to Linda's notes, he'd been especially helpful to Chen and her group, staying late to assist with their document requests and making copies of property records. Benjamin Drake, James muttered, typing on his phone. He's still in county government. In fact, his eyes widened. He's now the head of the county planning and zoning department. We found more recent entries where Linda had noticed Drake making unusual changes to property records. She'd started keeping a separate list of every modification, every suspicious document filing, every irregular access to the archives. It was a detailed record of how they'd laid the groundwork for their scheme. The final entry was from just weeks before Linda's unexpected death in 1995. Something bigger than rezoning is happening. The documents they're preparing, the plans I've glimpsed. This isn't just about development. They're creating a framework to take control of the entire valley piece by piece. I've made copies of everything I've found. Jack knows where they are. If anything happens to me, the entry ended there. Linda had passed away from what was ruled a heart attack shortly after. But Jack had kept her journals safe all these years, perhaps knowing they'd be needed someday. We need to find those copies, James said. If Linda made duplicates of the original documents, we could prove these HOAs were created as part of a fraudulent scheme. But where would Jack have hidden them, I wondered? And after 30 years, would they still be intact? Dad was staring out the barn window, lost in thought. Jack was clever about important things, he said slowly. He wouldn't have kept them anywhere obvious, but he would have wanted them somewhere significant, somewhere tied to the land itself. Suddenly his eyes lit up. The survey markers. When we bought the farm, Jack insisted on showing me all the original property survey markers himself, said it was crucial I know exactly where our boundaries were. But there was one marker he spent a lot of time at, out by the old creek bed. Said it was the most important one, that I should remember it specially. The sun was setting, but we grabbed flashlights and headed out to the creek. The marker was still there, a concrete post set deep in the ground. Dad ran his hands over it, feeling for something. Here, he said, finding a small indentation near the base. This doesn't match the other markers. Using tools from the barn, we carefully excavated around the post. About 2 feet down, we found a sealed PVC pipe cap. Inside was a waterproof tube containing dozens of documents, original copies of everything Linda had discovered, preserved and hidden by Jack Murphy 3 decades ago. As we carefully unrolled the papers in the barn's light, we knew we had finally found our smoking gun, but we also knew that the people behind this scheme wouldn't give up easily. They'd waited 30 years to put their plan in motion. They weren't going to let some old documents stop them now. As we pored over Linda Murphy's hidden documents in the barn, Mum suddenly remembered something that made everything click into place. Margaret Chen, she said, her voice trembling slightly. She wasn't just on the planning commission. She was at our closing when we bought the farm from Jack. Dad looked up sharply. What? I don't remember her being there. She wasn't inside the room, Mom explained. She was waiting in the hallway outside the title company's office. I remember because she tried to talk to Jack right after we finished signing the papers. He brushed her off, seemed angry about something. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now James was already pulling out the closing documents from 1993. Look at this, he said, pointing to a notation we'd overlooked before. There's a record of a competing offer that was withdrawn, just days before you bought the place. The potential buyer is listed as Mountain Vista Holdings, LLC. A quick search on James's phone revealed what we'd suspected. Mountain Vista Holdings had been another shell company connected to Riverside Agricultural Solutions. They'd tried to buy the farm before we did, but Jack had refused to sell to them. That's not all, Mum continued, her memory unlocking more details. A few weeks after we moved in, Chen showed up at the farm, said she was doing a routine property assessment for the county. Jack was still helping us learn the ropes of farming back then, and when he saw her truck coming up the drive, he told us to let him handle it. Dad nodded slowly, the memory returning. I remember that day. Jack met her at the gate. They had some kind of heated argument, but I couldn't hear what it was about. After she left, Jack seemed worried. That's when he started telling me how important it was to keep all our property documents in order. I pulled out Linda's journal entries from that specific time period. Sure enough, there was an entry about that very day. MC attempted to implement contingency plan at Murphy Farm today. Jack confronted her. She threatened to make things difficult for the new owners if he didn't cooperate. Jack told her he had evidence of what they were planning. She left angry. Need to document everything. Jack knew, I said quietly. He knew they were planning something with these fake HOAs, and he was gathering evidence to stop them. That's why he was so insistent. About keeping records, about knowing property boundaries, about everything. James was reading through more of the documents we'd found in the survey marker. It gets worse, he said. Look at these property assessments from 1994. Chen and Drake weren't just creating fake HOAs. They were systematically altering property records throughout the valley. Every piece of land they targeted had its records updated with these hidden HOA attachments. One document in particular caught my eye, a hand-drawn map showing the valley divided into what they called acquisition zones. Our farm was in Zone 1, along with the Miller's Dairy and several other properties that had already been lost to foreclosure. The map had dates written next to each zone, spanning decades into the future. They planned it all out, James explained. Which properties to target first, when to activate each fake HOA, even how long to wait between foreclosures to avoid raising suspicion. This wasn't just opportunistic fraud. It was a calculated long-term strategy to take control of the entire valley. Dad picked up a stack of photos from the document cache, old Polaroids Linda had taken of late-night meetings at the county office. In one, you could clearly see Margaret Chen and Benjamin Drake reviewing documents with a man in an expensive suit. The man's face was familiar, but I couldn't place it until Dad spoke up. That's Richard Kessler, he said grimly. He was Riverside's VP of land acquisition back then. These days, he's their CEO, Mom gasped. Kessler, wasn't he just appointed to the State Water Resources Board? James nodded. 6 months ago, right around the time they started accelerating these foreclosures. He spread out more documents. On the workbench, look at these water survey maps Linda copied. They knew something back then that nobody else did. This valley sits on one of the largest untapped aquifers in the state. And with the drought getting worse each year, water rights are becoming more valuable than gold, I added, the full picture finally becoming clear. They're not just after the land, they're after the water underneath it. A truck's headlights swept across the barn windows, and we quickly gathered up the documents. Through the dusty glass, we could see the same black SUVs from earlier parked at our gate. But this time, one of the vehicles had county sheriff markings on it. They know we found something, James said urgently. We need to get these documents somewhere safe, now. As we hurriedly packed everything into boxes, I couldn't help but think about Jack and Linda Murphy. They'd seen this coming 3 decades ago, had tried to warn everyone, had hidden away the evidence we'd need. They'd done everything they could to protect the valley's future. Now it was up to us to finish what they'd started. But first we had to get past the people watching our gate, people who'd spent 30 years making sure this evidence never came to light. With the sheriff's vehicle and black SUVs blocking our gate, we needed to act fast. James quickly photographed the remaining documents, while Dad and I packed everything back into the waterproof tube. Mom kept watch at the barn window, tracking our unwanted visitors' movements. "They're spreading out," she whispered. 2 men, heading toward the house, another 2 coming toward the barn, and she paused, squinting through the darkness. "Someone's getting out of the last SUV. It's Margaret Chen." Seeing Chen herself rather than sending lackeys told us just how serious this was. They must have been watching us, realized we'd discovered something important. The beam of a flashlight swept across the barn's exterior. "Back door," Dad whispered, motioning toward the rear exit. But before we could move, we heard footsteps on the gravel outside. They had the barn surrounded. The main door creaked open, and Margaret Chen stepped inside, flanked by 2 men in dark suits. She'd aged since that confrontation with Jack Murphy 30 years ago, but she carried herself with the same cold authority. A sheriff's deputy hovered uncertainly behind them. "Working late, aren't we?" Chen's voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp as they scanned the barn. "Though I suppose you have to, given the deadline. Less than 24 hours now until you need to cease operations." "This is private property." James stepped forward, positioning himself between Chen and the workbench where we'd hidden the documents. "You have no right to be here." "Actually," Chen smiled, pulling out a paper. "As the enforcement officer for Valley Estates HOA, I have every right to inspect properties for violations. And given the numerous complaints about unauthorized nighttime activities, we had to investigate. The sheriff's department is here merely as a precaution." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. I recognized him, Mike Reeves, who'd gone to high school with me. He seemed embarrassed to be there. "Pine Valley Estates HOA, I said, letting my anger show. "The same HOA that Linda Murphy discovered you creating back in 1994? The one you planned to use along with Crystal Mountain and Blue River to take over the valley piece by piece?" Chen's smile flickered for just a moment. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm simply here to ensure compliance with community guidelines that have been in place for 30 years. "Community guidelines?" Dad stepped forward. "For a community that doesn't exist. We found Jack's survey marker, Ms. Chen. We know about the documents Linda hid. We know about your meetings with Riverside, about the aquifer, about everything." For the first time, real concern crossed Chen's face. She glanced at her associates, then back at us. "If you found some old documents, I'd be very interested in seeing them. Perhaps we could come to an arrangement that would be beneficial for everyone, like the arrangement you offered the Millers, the Gundersons," I challenged. "Sell at a fraction of the real value or face foreclosure. The valley is changing." Chen's voice hardened. "Progress is inevitable. The small family farm is a relic of the past. We're offering a chance to be part of something bigger, a planned development that will bring prosperity to the entire region." "You mean stealing water rights from an entire community," James countered, "using fake HOAs to force people off their land so Riverside can control the aquifer. That kind of prosperity?" The deputy was listening intently now, his discomfort growing more visible. Chen noticed and changed tactics. "Whatever you think you found, it won't matter," she said coldly. 30 years of official county records show these HOAs are legitimate. No judge will overturn decades of documented history based on some old papers you claim to have found in a field. Besides, she smiled again, accidents happen, barns catch fire, documents get lost. The threat was clear. One of her men took a step forward, but Deputy Reeves suddenly spoke up. "Ms. Chen, are you threatening these people?" "Of course not," she replied smoothly, "simply pointing out that old buildings can be hazardous. In fact, I notice several safety violations that should be documented." She pulled out her phone and started taking photos. "Mike," I turned to the deputy, using his first name, "you know my family, you know this farm. Does any of this seem right to you? They're using fake HOAs to steal land, and they're using the sheriff's department to help them do it." Mike looked from me to Chen, then at the men with her. His hand moved to his body camera. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." the property. Without a warrant or clear evidence of a crime, this is trespassing. Deputy Reeves, Chen's voice was ice, remember our conversation about your mother's medical bills, how the county's special healthcare fund has been so helpful. Mike's face reddened, but he stood his ground. My body camera is running, Ms. Chen, has been since we arrived. Sure you want to continue that line of conversation? Chen's mask cracked for just a moment, showing the rage beneath, but she quickly composed herself. Very well, we'll go. But remember, she looked at each of us in turn, the deadline stands. 24 hours to cease all farming operations, or the fines begin, and there will be no more warnings. As they backed out of the barn, Chen paused at the door. Oh, and if you do have any interesting documents, I'd be careful about making copies. Distribution of forged materials is a serious crime. We'd hate to see charges filed. After they left, Mike turned to us. I don't know what's going on here, but something's not right. Chen's been pressuring a lot of deputies to help with these HOA enforcements, using county resources for private business. I'm not the only one who's uncomfortable with it. We have proof, James said, of all of it, but we need to get it somewhere safe before they come back with a warrant or worse. Mike nodded. Give me an hour. I'm going off shift, but I'll spread the word to some deputies I trust. Make sure nobody responds too quickly to any calls from this address tonight. He headed for the door, then turned back. And Sarah, whatever you found, make lots of copies. After he left, we stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. Chen had shown her hand. She was willing to use threats, intimidation, even arson to keep her scheme hidden. But she'd also revealed something crucial. She was scared of what we'd found. We need to move fast, James said. They'll be back, and next time they won't be so polite. We need to get these documents to people who can help before something happens to them, or to us. After Chen and her entourage left, we couldn't waste a minute. James immediately called a colleague at his law firm in Bozeman who specialized in digital forensics. We need to document everything exactly as we found it, he explained. Chain of custody is crucial if we want these documents to hold up in court. While James coordinated with his firm, I started digging deeper into Linda Murphy's papers. Her documentation was meticulous. She hadn't just collected evidence of the HOA scheme, she'd created a detailed timeline of how it all connected. One entry particularly caught my attention. March 15th, 1994. R.K. Richard Kessler met with MC and BD, Margaret Chen and Benjamin Drake after hours. Overheard discussion of water rights acquisition strategy, mentioned something called Project Phoenix, seems to involve multiple phases over 30-plus years. Phase 1, create paper trail for HOAs. Phase 2, wait for property values to peak. Phase 3, execute foreclosures and force sales. Final phase, implementation of primary water infrastructure. Linda had attached a rough map showing proposed water pipeline routes throughout the valley. All of them converged on a central point, exactly where our farm's deepest well was located. The well that old Jack had always said was special, that tapped into what he called the sweet spot of the valley's water table. Look at this, I showed James. They didn't choose our farm at random. According to these geological surveys Linda copied, our property sits on top of the main access point to the aquifer. That's why they tried to buy it from Jack first, before creating the fake HOA scheme. Dad was examining another document, a preliminary engineering report from 1993. This shows they knew about the aquifer's potential even back then. Their scientists predicted severe drought conditions would hit Montana within 30-40 years, making water rights exponentially more valuable. And now Richard Kessler is on the state water board, Mom added, just as those predictions are coming true. James's law firm colleague arrived with specialized scanning equipment. As he carefully documented each piece of evidence, we continued piecing together the puzzle. Linda's records revealed a complex web of shell companies, all leading back to Riverside Agricultural Solutions. They'd been quietly buying up small parcels of land throughout the valley, always through different subsidiaries, always keeping their purchases just small enough to avoid triggering regulatory oversight. But the HOAs were their masterstroke. By creating multiple fake associations with backdated documents, they could target any property they wanted. The timing of enforcement was strategic. They'd wait until property values peaked, then suddenly discover decades of unpaid dues. The foreclosure threats and pressure to sell would follow, always through their network of shell companies. "Look at these property transfers," James said, spreading out county records we'd found in Linda's cache. Every time a farm was foreclosed on or forced to sell, ownership would bounce between 3 or 4 different companies before landing with a Riverside subsidiary. They were deliberately obscuring the paper trail. I was going through Linda's final notes when something clicked. "Wait a minute," I said, pulling up an image on my phone. The photo Dad had identified of Richard Kessler meeting with Chen and Drake. In the background, partially visible on a desk, was a leather portfolio with a distinctive logo. "I've seen that logo before," I said, scrolling through photos from our recent visit to the county records office. There, on Mrs. Henderson's desk, the same portfolio. James leaned in to look. "That's not just any portfolio. That's a custom piece from a luxury brand. They make specialized document carriers for law firms and corporate executives. But look at the monogram under the logo. The initials were tiny but clear. RK. Mrs. Henderson has Richard Kessler's old portfolio," I said slowly. "The one he had 30 years ago when they were planning all this. And now she's disappeared right when we started asking questions about HOA documents," James added. "This isn't just about her finding suspicious records. She must have found something in that portfolio, something they desperately want to keep hidden." Dad was already pulling up local news archives on his laptop. "Here," he said grimly. 3 months ago, Mrs. Henderson filed a request for early retirement, but look at the property records from that same week. The records showed she had suddenly paid off her mortgage and purchased a new house in Florida, all in cash. On paper, it looked like a normal retirement plan, but given everything we now knew, "They bought her off," Mom said quietly. "Or threatened. Her? Maybe both?" "Maybe," I replied, "but she left us a breadcrumb trail. That portfolio didn't end up on her desk by accident. She wanted someone to notice it, to make the connection." James was already making calls. "I know a private investigator in Florida. We need to find Mrs. Henderson before they do something to silence her permanently, like they did with Linda Murphy." As if to emphasize the urgency of our situation, we heard vehicles on the road again. Through the barn windows, we could see more black SUVs slowly driving past, their headlights sweeping across our property. They were watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. But we had something they didn't know about yet. Linda's final notebook, the one where she'd documented everything she'd discovered about Project Phoenix and its ultimate goals. We just had to figure out what it all meant before they found a way to destroy the evidence, and us along with it. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning. While James's colleague continued scanning documents, I was cross-referencing Linda's notes with current property records when I noticed something odd about the timing of Mrs. Henderson's retirement. She'd filed her paperwork exactly 1 day after accessing a specific set of archived county records, files from a seemingly unrelated 1992 water rights survey. "James," I called him over, "can you pull up those water survey documents? The ones Mrs. Henderson looked at right before she retired?" He accessed the county database through his law firm's portal. The files should have been there. The access log showed they existed, but instead we got an error message. The records had been deleted 3 months ago, right after Mrs. Henderson's last day at work. "They're covering their tracks," James muttered. "But why these specific documents? What was in that 1992 survey that scared them so much?" Dad had been quiet for a while, staring at Linda's map of the valley. Now he spoke up. "The survey team," he said slowly. "I remember Jack talking about them. Said they weren't really from the county, that they were looking for something specific." He walked over to old Jack's filing cabinet in the corner of the barn and pulled out a dusty folder. Jack kept records of everyone who ever came onto the property. Said it was important to document everything. Inside was a visitor log from 1992, including details about the survey team. "Look at this," Dad pointed to a name on the log. "The head surveyor, Robert Kessler, Richard Kessler's father," James confirmed after a quick search on his phone. "He was a hydrological engineer, specialized in aquifer mapping. He died in a car accident in early 1993, right after completing the Valley survey." I felt a chill run down my spine. Right before Riverside started buying up land options, right before they created the fake HOAs. Mom had been going through more of Linda's papers. "Here," she said, holding up a newspaper clipping. "Robert Kessler's obituary." Linda circled something. The obituary was standard enough, but at the end was an interesting detail. "In lieu of flowers, the family requests donations to the Pine Valley Conservation Trust." "The Pine Valley Conservation Trust," James repeated, typing rapidly on his laptop. "It was dissolved in 1994, right when they created the HOAs. But look who was on its board of directors." The list included both Margaret Chen and Benjamin Drake, along with Richard Kessler. But it was another name that caught my attention. Thomas Walker, the county clerk who had helped file the original HOA documents. "They used the Conservation Trust as cover," James explained. "Created it to gain access to property records and water surveys, then dissolved it once they had what they needed. Classic shell game, but something still didn't add up." Why go to all this trouble? I wondered aloud. Why not just buy the land legally, or use eminent domain if the water rights were so valuable? The answer came from Linda's final notebook. In an entry dated just weeks before her death, she'd written, "RK's father found something bigger than just an aquifer. Overheard him talking about geological anomaly and unprecedented mineral deposits. Whatever's under this valley, the water rights are just their cover story." James's colleague, who had been quietly scanning documents this whole time, suddenly spoke up. "You need to see this," he said, pointing to his laptop screen. He'd been using specialized software to enhance some of the faded documents, and one of Linda's photographs had revealed something we'd missed. In the background of the photo showing Chen and Drake with Richard Kessler, there was a partially visible geological survey map on the wall. With the enhancement, we could now make out handwritten notes in the margins. "Rare earth elements confirmed. Estimated value 2 to 3B at current market. Access requires water table reduction. Timeline 25 to 30 years for drought conditions to enable extraction." "That's what this is really about," I said, the pieces finally falling into place. "They're not just after water rights. They're using the drought and these fake HOAs to clear the land so they can drain the aquifer and mine rare earth minerals. They've been playing a 30-year game to set this up." James was already documenting everything with his phone. "This is way bigger than property fraud. This is environmental manipulation, securities fraud, conspiracy." He was interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer. Through the barn windows, we could see emergency lights reflecting off the clouds, lots of them, heading our way. "They're not waiting for the deadline," Dad said grimly. "They know we've found something big. They're coming now." Mum was already grabbing the most crucial documents. "We need to get these somewhere safe, somewhere they won't think to look." I know where, I said, remembering something else from old Jack's property log. Something about a sealed mine shaft on the back 40 that wasn't on any official maps. But we have to move fast. As the sirens grew closer, we quickly packed the essential evidence. We could see multiple vehicles turning onto our access road. Police cars, county vehicles, and those same black SUVs. They were coming in force this time, probably with a warrant, real or manufactured. But thanks to Linda Murphy's meticulous documentation and Mrs. Henderson's breadcrumb trail, we finally knew what we were really fighting for. This wasn't just about saving our farm anymore. This was about stopping a decades-long conspiracy that threatened the entire valley's future. We just had to survive the next few hours to expose it. With emergency vehicles closing in, we needed legal protection. Fast. James was already on the phone with his law firm's senior partner, Catherine Martinez, known for handling high-profile environmental cases. He had her on speaker as we quickly moved the most crucial documents. Let me get this straight. Catherine's voice crackled through the phone. You have evidence of a 30-year conspiracy involving fake HOAs, fraudulent county records, and a plan to drain an aquifer for rare earth mining. And now they're coming with what I assume will be a conveniently obtained warrant. That's the short version, James replied, helping Dad move the file boxes. We need emergency injunctive relief, and we need it now. Where are you physically located? Catherine asked. When we told her, she paused. Judge Anderson is on call tonight in that district. He's tough but fair, and more importantly, he has no connections to Riverside or the county government. I can have him on the phone in 5 minutes. While Catherine worked on getting the judge, we could see the vehicles turning into our driveway. 3 police cars, 2 county sheriff vehicles, an unmarked black SUV, and what looked like a county fire marshal truck. They were bringing everyone they could think of to make this look official. Listen carefully, Catherine said, coming back on the line. I've got Judge Anderson reviewing our emergency petition right now, but until he rules, they have a technically valid warrant. Don't resist, but don't volunteer anything either. And whatever you do, don't let them take any original documents. Those are now evidence in a federal investigation. Federal investigation? I asked. I've got a colleague from law school who works for the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, Catherine explained. The minute you mentioned rare earth mining and aquifer manipulation, this became a federal environmental crime. She's already pulling together a task force. We could hear car doors slamming outside. James quickly set up his phone to record video, placing it on a high shelf with a clear view of the barn interior. Through the windows, we could see Margaret. Chen emerging from the SUV, accompanied by Benjamin Drake and 2 men in expensive suits. One more thing, Catherine added urgently. There's a sealed federal case from 1993 involving Robert Kessler's death. My EPA contact is trying to get it unsealed right now. Whatever you do, stall them. We need 20 minutes. The barn door swung. Open. Chen entered first, followed by a police officer holding up a warrant. Behind them came Drake and the 2 suits, who James recognized as Riverside's corporate lawyers. Search warrant, the officer announced, though he looked uncomfortable. Step away from any documents or materials. Chen smiled that cold smile of hers. We have reason to believe you're in possession of forged documents, attempting to defame legitimate business entities. For your own protection, we need to take custody of any papers or materials related to Pine Valley Estates or any other homeowners. Associations. I'm afraid we can't allow that, James replied calmly. These documents are now evidence in an active federal investigation. Any attempt to remove or destroy them would constitute obstruction of justice and tampering with federal evidence. One of the Riverside lawyers stepped forward. There is no federal investigation. This is a simple local matter involving HOA violations and potentially forged documents. Really? James held up his phone, showing an email from Catherine. Because the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division seems to disagree. especially regarding the environmental implications of Project Phoenix. Chen's smile vanished. Drake took an involuntary step backward. The police officer looked between them, clearly sensing something was wrong. "Officer," I spoke up, "before you execute that warrant, you should know that your body camera is recording evidence of a 30-year conspiracy involving environmental crimes, water rights fraud, and the manipulation of county records. Do you really want to be on video helping them cover that up?" The officer's hand went to his camera, then to the warrant. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Drake, is there something I should know about this situation?" Before they could answer, James's phone rang. He put it on speaker. "Mr. Richardson." Judge Anderson's voice filled the barn. "I've reviewed the emergency petition and supporting evidence. I'm granting an immediate stay on all search warrants and HOA enforcement actions pending a full hearing. Furthermore, I'm ordering the preservation of all documents in their current location to be supervised by federal marshals who are en route to your property." The change in the room was instant. The police officer lowered the warrant. The Riverside lawyers started whispering urgently to each other. Chen's face had gone pale. "Additionally," the judge continued, "I'm ordering all county officials involved in this matter to preserve all records and communications. Any attempt to delete, modify, or destroy documents will result in immediate contempt charges." Drake looked like he might be sick. He knew, probably better than anyone, how many records would need to disappear to cover their tracks. "Your Honor," one of the Riverside lawyers tried to interject, "we need to object to this unprecedented—" "Save your objections for the hearing, Counselor," Judge Anderson cut him off. "U.S. Marshals will be there within 15 minutes. Until then, nobody touches anything. Is that clear?" As if on cue, we could hear more sirens in the distance. But these were different from before. Federal agents were coming, and suddenly our uninvited guests couldn't leave fast enough. "This isn't over," Chen hissed as they hurried out. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Actually," I called after her, holding up Linda's notebook, "thanks to some very careful people who came before us, we know exactly what we're dealing with, and so will everyone else." As we watched them drive away, Catherine came back on James's phone. "Good work, but this is just the beginning. They're going to throw everything they have at discrediting these documents and anyone associated with them. Are you ready for what comes next?" Looking at my family, seeing the determination in their faces, I knew the answer. We had the truth, we had the evidence, and most importantly, we had each other. "We've been ready for 30 years, I replied. "We just didn't know it until now." The next few days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvers and increasingly aggressive tactics from Riverside and their allies. Their response showed just how desperate they were to keep their scheme hidden. It started with a massive legal filing, over 500 pages of motions, objections, and demands, all hitting us at once. "They're trying to bury us in paperwork," Catherine explained during an emergency meeting at her firm's offices. "It's a classic tactic, overwhelm the opposition with so many legal challenges that they run out of money defending them." But Riverside wasn't just fighting us in court. The morning after Judge Anderson's stay order, we woke up to find local news vans parked outside our farm. The lead story on every channel was about local farmers fabricating evidence to avoid HOA obligations. They'd somehow gotten hold of edited versions of our documents, carefully selected and taken out of context to make us look like the fraudsters. "Margaret." "Chen gave an exclusive interview to Channel 5, James said, showing us the footage on his laptop. There she was, looking every bit the concerned public servant, expressing her deep disappointment that respected members of the community would resort to such desperate tactics to avoid their responsibilities. The PR assault didn't stop there. Suddenly, concerned citizens were writing letters to the editor about the importance of maintaining community standards. Opinion pieces appeared questioning whether traditional farming was still appropriate in the rapidly developing valley. Even our neighbors started receiving glossy brochures about the exciting future of Pine Valley Estates. But the real blow came when they went after our allies. Mrs. Henderson's daughter called in tears. Her mother's Florida retirement community had suddenly cancelled her lease, claiming administrative errors. The private investigator, James, had hired to find her, reported that she was being followed by unmarked vehicles. Deputy Mike Reeves was suddenly under investigation for improper use of body camera footage. His mother's special healthcare fund was under review. Even Catherine's law firm started losing long-term clients who'd mysteriously decided to take their business elsewhere. "They're sending a message," Dad said grimly. "Cross us, and we'll destroy everything you care about." The pressure kept mounting. Our farm equipment started experiencing mysterious breakdowns. Hydraulic lines cut, fuel tanks contaminated, electronic systems failing. The local repair shops suddenly couldn't fit us into their schedule. When we tried to hire mechanics from outside the area, their trucks would get pulled over for routine inspections that took hours. Then came the financial squeeze. Our bank notified us that our operating loans were being re-evaluated. The local grain elevator suddenly couldn't accept our deliveries due to capacity issues. Even our insurance company sent notice that our policy might not be renewed due to changing risk assessments. But the most brazen move came from Benjamin Drake's office at the county. They discovered that our original property surveys from 1993 had been incorrect. According to their new assessment, our property lines were off by several feet, just enough to put our main grain silo on what they now claimed was county right-of-way. "They're not even trying to be subtle anymore," James said, reviewing the new survey documents. "These measurements contradict 30 years of official records. It's completely arbitrary." "But it's signed by licensed surveyors," Catherine pointed out. "They found people willing to put their professional credentials behind this fraud. That's how deep their influence runs." The surveyor situation gave us our first real counterattack opportunity. James had noticed something odd about the signatures. They were from a firm in Idaho that had recently been acquired by a shell company. A little digging revealed that the shell company traced back to none other than Richard Kessler's wife. "Got you," Catherine said when we showed her the connection. "Using a family member's company to create fraudulent surveys. That's a direct conflict of interest and probably criminal conspiracy." But before we could file our motion exposing the survey fraud, Riverside's lawyers dropped another bomb. They'd filed an emergency petition with a different judge, one known to be friendly to development interests, claiming that our farm's continued operation was causing immediate and irreparable harm to the community. Their evidence? Water quality reports showing elevated mineral levels in local wells, reports prepared by a testing lab that, surprise, surprise, was owned by another Riverside subsidiary. They were trying to use environmental concerns to shut us down, while hiding their own plans to drain the aquifer. The irony would be hilarious if it wasn't so infuriating, Mom said, reading their filing. "They're accusing us of endangering the very resources they plan to destroy." The new judge scheduled an emergency hearing for the next morning. If he ruled in their favor, we could be forced to cease operations immediately, regardless of Judge Anderson's stay order. They were trying to forum shop, looking for any judge who would give them what they wanted. We spent that night preparing our defense, knowing that each new challenge was burning through more of our limited resources. But we also knew that every desperate move they made, every obvious abuse of power, was just proving how right we were about the corruption at the heart of their scheme. "They're getting sloppy," James noted, reviewing their latest filings. "All these connections they're exposing, all these conflicts of interest, they're giving us more ammunition for the federal investigation." "Maybe," Dad replied, "but can we survive long enough to use it? They're hitting us from every angle, and they've got a lot more resources than we do." Looking at our dwindling bank accounts and mounting legal bills, I had to wonder the same thing. We had the truth on our side. But in a fight this big, would that be enough? Just when things seemed darkest, something unexpected happened. The community began fighting back. It started with Bob Miller, the former dairy farmer who'd lost his land. He'd been running the farm supply store since losing his property, and he'd seen firsthand how many farmers were being squeezed by mysterious HOA claims. "I'm done being quiet," he announced one morning, walking into Catherine's office while we were preparing for the emergency hearing. "I've got records of every equipment failure, every suspicious inspection, every administrative delay that's happened to farmers in this valley over the past 5 years. Been keeping track, figuring someday someone would need to know." His records were a gold mine. They showed a clear pattern of harassment targeting any farmer who resisted development pressure. More importantly, they proved coordination between county officials and private businesses to obstruct farming operations. "Look at these inspection reports," Bob pointed out. "Same phraseology, same violations cited, even though they're supposedly from different agencies. Someone's orchestrating this from the top." But Bob wasn't the only one who'd been keeping records. Eric Gunderson, who'd installed those security cameras on his property, had captured something crucial. His cameras had caught county vehicles entering properties late at night, always just before those properties would receive HOA violation notices. "They were planting evidence," Eric explained, showing us his footage. "Putting up those weathered HOA signs, dropping old-looking notices in mailboxes, creating their paper trail after the fact." The footage showed Benjamin Drake himself supervising some of these late-night operations. In one clip, you could clearly hear him directing workers to make it look aged as they installed signposts. Word started spreading through the farming community. People began coming forward with their own stories, their own evidence. The Hendersons had photos of Margaret Chen meeting with developers years before HOA notices appeared. The Patels had recordings of phone calls where county officials pressured them to sell. The Rodriguez family had saved emails threatening their water rights if they didn't cooperate with community development plans. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. Thomas Walker's widow, the wife of the former county clerk who'd helped file the original HOA documents, contacted Catherine through her church pastor. "Tom knew what they were doing was wrong," Mrs. Walker told us, her hands shaking as she handed over a sealed envelope. "He kept evidence, just in case. Said if anything happened to him, I should wait until someone started asking the right questions." Inside the envelope was a micro-cassette tape from 1994. On it, you could hear Margaret Chen and Richard Kessler discussing their plans with Thomas Walker. They talked openly about creating backdated HOA documents, about using the drought predictions to justify water rights seizures, about the rare earth minerals they'd discovered. "The beauty of it is, by the time anyone figures it out, the statute of limitations will have expired," Kessler's voice said clearly on the tape. 30 years from now, who's going to be able to prove when these HOAs were really created? The tape was a bombshell, but Mrs. Walker had more. "Tom didn't die of natural causes," she said quietly. "The night before his heart attack, he told me he was going to expose everything, said he couldn't live with the guilt anymore." This revelation changed everything. Catherine immediately contacted her EPA colleague. If Thomas Walker had been murdered to cover up environmental crimes, this wasn't just fraud anymore. This was a RICO case, a criminal conspiracy spanning decades. The community support continued growing. Local farmers organized a convoy of grain trucks to help us transport our harvest when the local elevator wouldn't accept our deliveries. Mechanics from 3 counties over started making house calls to repair our equipment, escorted by sympathetic sheriff's deputies to prevent harassment. Even the media narrative began to shift. A young reporter from the state capital, investigating the connection between Riverside and the State Water Board, published a series of articles questioning Richard Kessler's rapid rise to power. She'd uncovered a pattern of suspicious deaths, and disappearances connected to the company's land acquisitions across multiple states. The pressure was still intense. We were still fighting multiple legal battles, still facing financial strain, still dealing with daily harassment, but we weren't alone anymore. Every day, more people came forward with their own pieces of the puzzle, their own evidence of the corruption that had plagued our valley for decades. They thought they could isolate us, Dad said one evening, watching a group of volunteers help repair our fence line. They thought if they picked us off one by one, nobody would see the pattern. But they forgot something important about farming communities. "What's that?" I asked. "We help each other," he replied. "Always have, always will. And once people understand what's really happening, what's really at stake, well, there's no amount of money or legal tricks that can stop a community that's decided to fight back." Looking at all the people working together to save not just our farm but the entire valley's future, I realized he was right. Riverside and their conspirators had spent 30 years building their scheme, but they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They thought time was on their side. That 30 years would bury the truth. Instead, it had given the truth time to grow roots, deep and strong, just waiting for the right moment to break through to the surface. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived with an unexpected twist. As we pulled up to the courthouse, we found the parking lot packed with farming families from across the valley. Word had spread about the hearing, and they'd come to show support. Many carried handmade signs: "Stop the fake HOAs, save our farms, water rights are human rights." Inside the courtroom, Catherine was reviewing our strategy one last time when her phone buzzed. Her EPA contact had finally gotten the 1993 federal case about Robert Kessler's death unsealed. What they found was staggering. The FBI had been investigating him, Catherine whispered, scanning the documents. They suspected he'd discovered something during the water survey that Riverside wanted to keep quiet. The night before his accident, he'd contacted the Environmental Crimes Division. But before we could digest this information, the courtroom doors burst open. Margaret Chen strode in, followed by not just Riverside's usual lawyers, but an entire team of new attorneys. Leading them was Maxwell Sterling, one of the most expensive corporate lawyers in the country. "They're bringing out the big guns," James uttered. "Sterling charges $1,200 an hour. They must be really scared." The hearing began with Sterling immediately moving to dismiss all our evidence. He argued that the documents we'd found were inadmissible, claiming they were unverified, photocopies of questionable origin. When Catherine tried to introduce Linda Murphy's journals, he objected, calling them hearsay from a deceased witness. But Judge Anderson wasn't easily swayed. "Mr. Sterling," he interrupted, "are you suggesting that Mrs. Murphy fabricated 30 years of detailed records, including physical evidence, just to create a false conspiracy?" Sterling smiled smoothly. "Your Honor, we have evidence that these so-called journals were recently created as part of a scheme to avoid legitimate HOA obligations." He produced affidavits from 3 forensic document experts, all claiming the journals showed signs of recent manufacture. That's when our preparation paid off. Catherine stood up. "Your Honor, we anticipated this claim." She motioned to a man in the back of the courtroom, Dr. Marcus Zhang, from the University of Montana's Advanced Materials Lab. Dr. Zhang has conducted a full spectroscopic analysis of the journal paper, ink, and binding materials. Dr. Zhang approached the bench with his findings. "The paper and ink compounds definitively date to the early 1990s, he testified. "Furthermore, the sequential degradation of the materials proves these journals were written over time, not created recently." Sterling's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on. He called Margaret Chen to the stand, where she gave a polished performance about the HOA's legitimate origins and her concerns about rural blight affecting property values. During cross-examination, Catherine let Chen talk, letting her confidence grow. Then she pulled out the microcassette player. "Miss Chen, are you familiar with this recording?" she asked, holding up Thomas Walker's tape. Chen's composure cracked for just a moment. "I couldn't say. It appears to be an old tape." "Let me refresh your memory," Catherine said, pressing play. Chen's own voice filled the courtroom, 30 years younger but unmistakable, discussing the creation of fake HOA documents with Richard Kessler. The effect was electric. Chen's face went pale. Sterling jumped up with objections, but the damage was done. The tape continued playing, revealing detailed discussions of their long-term plan. But the real bombshell came when Catherine introduced our newest evidence. Mrs. Henderson had been found. She wasn't in Florida at all. She'd been hiding in Wyoming, protected by federal marshals, and she was ready to testify via video link. "Objection!" Sterling shouted. "This witness wasn't on the approved list." "Neither was your entire new legal team, Mr. Sterling," Judge Anderson replied dryly. "I'll allow it." Mrs. Henderson's face appeared on the courtroom screen. She looked tired but determined. She held up a familiar leather portfolio, Richard Kessler's old document carrier. "I found this hidden in the county archives," she testified. Inside were the original drafts of their plan, including geological surveys showing rare earth deposits, water table drainage calculations, and a 30-year timeline for land acquisition through forced sales. She went on to describe how she'd been approached by Riverside's representatives after finding the portfolio. They'd offered her money to stay quiet, then threats when she hesitated. She'd taken their money and fled, but not before making copies of everything. Sterling tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she'd stolen county property and fabricated documents. That's when Catherine played her final card. "Your Honor," she said, "we'd like to call our next witness, Richard Kessler himself." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Chen's head snapped up in shock. Sterling frantically whispered with his team. "Mr. Kessler was served with a federal subpoena this morning," Catherine explained. "He's waiting to testify via video link from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Helena." Judge Anderson checked his watch. "Given the significance of this testimony, we'll take a brief recess. Court will resume in 15 minutes. As the judge left the bench, we watched Chen and her lawyers huddle in urgent discussion. They looked rattled, and with good reason. Richard Kessler was the one person who could confirm everything, the fake HOAs, the rare earth minerals, his father's death, all of it. The question was, would he protect himself by telling the truth, or would he stick to their 30-year-old lie? In 15 minutes, we'd find out. The 15-minute recess stretched into an hour as technical difficulties mysteriously plagued the video link to Richard Kessler. When we finally reconnected, the man who appeared on screen looked nothing like the confident CEO from recent news photos. He was pale, nervous, continually looking off-camera as if seeking guidance. Catherine began her questioning, but Kessler's answers were robotic, rehearsed. Yes, the HOAs were legitimate. No, he knew nothing about any conspiracy. No, his father's death was a tragic accident. It was obvious someone had gotten to him during the delay. Then came the devastating news. During the technical difficulties, Riverside's lawyers had managed to get an emergency stay from a federal appeals court judge, one who, we later learned, had significant investments in Riverside's parent company. Judge Anderson was forced to suspend the hearing. "My hands are tied," he said, clearly frustrated. "Until the appeals court reviews the jurisdiction question, we're in limbo." But it got worse. The appeals court judge hadn't just stayed our hearing. He'd also suspended Judge Anderson's previous order protecting our documents. Technically, all our evidence was now vulnerable to seizure under the original warrant. "Pack everything up now," Catherine ordered. "They'll be coming with that warrant as soon as they leave the courthouse." We worked frantically to gather the documents, but we weren't fast enough. As we loaded the last box into James's car, 3 police cruisers and the now familiar black SUVs pulled up. Margaret Chen emerged, holding the reactivated warrant A triumphant smile on her face. "This time," she said, "we're taking everything." What followed was a gut-wrenching hour of watching them box up all our evidence. Linda's journals, the survey documents, everything we'd worked so hard to protect. They even took James's laptop, claiming it contained relevant materials. Catherine argued, cited legal precedents, threatened consequences, but the warrant was technically valid. All we could do was document what they were taking and watch our case being loaded into their vehicles. The final blow came as they were leaving. One of the Riverside lawyers handed me another document, an emergency injunction from the same appeals court judge, ordering us to cease all farming operations. Immediately. "You have 24 hours to shut down," he said with a smirk. "After that, every violation is a $10,000 fine per day." Dad sank into a kitchen chair, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. "Even if we win the appeal," he said quietly, "we can't survive a shutdown. The bank won't extend our loans without income, and this year's crop needs to be harvested now." He was right. In the farming business, timing is everything. Miss your harvest window and you lose everything. Our wheat was ready now. If we couldn't bring it in, we'd lose not just this year's crop, but any chance of paying our mounting legal bills. The hits kept coming. That evening, our insurance company officially cancelled our policy, citing increased risk factors. The bank followed up with a notice of default on our equipment loans. Without insurance or operating capital, we couldn't even sell the farm if we wanted to. "They're not just trying to beat us in court," James explained grimly. "They're trying to destroy us completely, make an example of what happens when someone fights back." The news spread quickly through the farming community. Several families who'd been supporting us suddenly went quiet, scared of facing the same retaliation. The local paper, which had been covering our story, suddenly dropped it. Even some of our longtime friends stopped returning calls. Late that night, we gathered in the kitchen, trying to figure out our next move. The house felt strange, knowing it might be our last night here. Mom was going through old photo albums. Dad was staring out at the fields, and James was still making desperate legal calls. That's when we heard engines on the access road. Thinking it was Chen's people coming back for something else, we looked out the window. What we saw instead brought tears to my eyes. A line of combine harvesters was pulling up to our fields, headlights blazing in the darkness. Behind them came trucks, tractors, and cars. It looked like half the farming families in the valley had shown up. Bob Miller stepped onto our porch. "They can stop one farm from harvesting," he said simply, "but they can't stop all of us. We'll bring in your crop. Tonight, let them try to prove who did what in the dark." For the next 8 hours, under cover of darkness, our neighbors risked everything to help us. Combines moved through our wheat fields like a coordinated army. Trucks shuttled grain to small private storage bins scattered across the valley. Everyone worked in silent determination, knowing what was at stake. By dawn, most of our crop was harvested, not through our own equipment, which was now legally barred from operating, but through the collective effort of an entire community that refused to let bullies win. But we all knew this was just a temporary victory. We'd saved this year's crop, but without our evidence, without the ability to farm, without insurance or loans, we were still losing the bigger battle. They were still going to take our land, still going to drain the aquifer, still going to destroy the valley's future, unless we could find a way to fight back. Unless we could figure out why Richard Kessler had looked so nervous on that video link, and who had been standing off camera, controlling his testimony. The community harvest had bought us some breathing room, but we knew Riverside would retaliate. Hard once they discovered what had happened. We needed a new strategy, and we needed it fast. "We've been playing their game," James said during our emergency strategy session the next morning. "Fighting in their courts, following their rules. Maybe it's time to change the battlefield." He was right. While they'd seized our physical evidence, they couldn't seize what people knew. And thanks to all the families who'd come forward, we had dozens of witnesses to their pattern of corruption and intimidation. That's when Catherine came up with a bold plan. They're worried about public exposure. That's why they fought so hard to suppress the evidence. So let's give them something bigger to worry about. She made some calls, and by that afternoon, we were sitting down with Sarah Martinez, an investigative reporter from the state's largest newspaper. She'd been digging into Riverside's activities across multiple states, finding similar patterns of land grabs and environmental manipulation. What you've uncovered here isn't isolated, Sarah explained, showing us her research. They've used variations of this scheme in at least 6 other states, always targeting agricultural areas with untapped resources, always using local officials to create fake legal pressure, always forcing sales just before major development announcements. But Montana was different. Here they'd gotten sloppy, left too many traces. Maybe it was the 30-year timeline, maybe it was too many people involved, or maybe they'd just gotten overconfident. Whatever the reason, they'd created a paper trail that, once exposed, would reveal their entire operation. We spent hours sharing everything we remembered from the seized documents. Sarah recorded every detail, cross-referenced every name, and started connecting dots we hadn't even seen. "Look at this," she said, pulling up property records from other states. "Every time they've pulled this scheme, there's been a shell company called Phoenix Holdings involved. And guess who sits on Phoenix's board? The same appeals court judge who stayed your case. It was a clear conflict of interest, one that could invalidate his ruling. But we had an even bigger breakthrough when Sarah dug into Richard Kessler's recent activities. 2 days before his video testimony, he transferred a massive amount of stock to an offshore account, she revealed. Then his wife filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting an emergency hearing to freeze their assets. She knows something's coming. The pieces were falling into place. Kessler was preparing for a fall, trying to protect assets before everything blew up. His nervous testimony made sense now. He was trying to buy time to get his affairs in order before the truth came out. But we needed more than just theories. We needed proof that couldn't be seized or suppressed. That's when Mum remembered something crucial. "The backup cameras," she said suddenly. "The ones Jack installed after the vandalism incidents in '95. They ran to that old VHS recorder in the barn basement." Dad's eyes lit up. Jack never threw anything away. Those tapes would still be down there. We raced to the barn. Hidden behind decades of accumulated farm equipment, we found boxes of old VHS tapes, carefully labeled and dated. And there, on a tape from March 1994, we struck gold. The grainy footage showed Margaret Chen and Richard Kessler's father meeting with Jack Murphy, trying to pressure him to sell. More importantly, it captured them openly discussing their plans for the valley. "Once we control the water rights," Robert Kessler said clearly on the tape. "We can name our price. These farmers don't understand what they're sitting on. The rare earth deposits alone are worth billions. We had them on video, admitting their scheme decades ago, but the real bombshell came near the end of the tape. Robert Kessler mentioned something called Operation Phoenix and a timeline for removing obstacles. 2 weeks later, he died in his suspicious car accident. Sarah's eyes were wide as she watched the footage. "This isn't just about land fraud anymore," she said. "This is about murder, conspiracy, environmental crimes, and it's all documented on these tapes." We quickly made digital copies, sending them to multiple secure locations. Sarah began preparing a massive exposé, coordinating with other reporters across the country who'd been investigating similar cases. But we knew Riverside wouldn't go down without a fight. As if to prove this point, we received an unexpected visitor that evening, Benjamin Drake, looking nervous and carrying a thick envelope. "They know about the tapes," he said without preamble. "They're coming tonight with a fake warrant claiming terrorist activity. They'll tear this place apart looking for them. He handed me the envelope. This is everything I have. Internal memos, bank transfers, names of everyone involved. I'm getting out before it all explodes. Why help us now? I asked. Because Margaret Chen just called an emergency board meeting, he replied. I saw the agenda. The first item is liability mitigation through asset liquidation. I've seen that phrase before, right before other accidents happened. They're planning something big, and they're planning it soon. As Drake drove away, we knew we were in a race against time. We had the truth, we had the evidence, and we had people ready to expose it all. But we also had powerful enemies who would stop at nothing to keep their 30-year scheme hidden. The next 24 hours would determine everything, not just for our farm, but for every community where Riverside had planted their poisonous seeds of corruption. Drake's warning about the emergency board meeting set off alarm bells. We needed to understand exactly what liability mitigation through asset liquidation meant before they could put their plan into action. James started making calls to his legal contacts while Sarah dug into her investigative files. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, still in protective custody in Wyoming, had been going through Kessler's old portfolio, page by page. Hidden in what looked like routine business documents, she found a coded reference to something called Protocol Phoenix. It's their emergency containment procedure, she explained over a secure video call. They've used it before, in other states where their schemes were about to be exposed. They deliberately trigger an environmental crisis, then use it as cover to destroy evidence and force immediate property sales. The implications hit us like a thunderbolt. The aquifer. They weren't just planning to drain it slowly anymore. They were going to poison it, create an immediate public health emergency that would give them the power to seize land through emergency declarations. Sarah quickly connected the dots. Look at these satellite images, she said, pulling up environmental surveys. They've already installed injection wells around the valley, disguised as irrigation equipment. And these shipping manifests from last week. She pointed to several. Large chemical deliveries to a Riverside subsidiary. They're going to contaminate the groundwater, James said grimly, create a crisis that forces immediate evacuation. Once people are out, they can demolish buildings, destroy records, and clean up any evidence under the guise of environmental remediation. We had hours, at most, to stop them, but we needed proof of their immediate plans, not just historical evidence. That's when Dad remembered something about the old mine shaft on our back 40, the one we'd originally thought about using to hide documents. Jack used to talk about how that shaft connected to the aquifer, he said. Said it was one reason he never sealed it properly. He used it to monitor water levels. We grabbed flashlights and rope and headed out to the mine. The entrance was overgrown, hidden behind years of vegetation, but it was there. And so was something else. Fresh tire tracks leading to it. Carefully, we approached the entrance. Inside, we found recently installed equipment, monitoring devices, pressure gauges, and several large tanks connected to industrial pumps. All of it bore serial numbers matching the shipping manifest Sarah had found. "They're ready to go," James said, photographing everything. "These tanks are full of something, and those pumps are connected directly to the aquifer." Sarah was already calling her EPA contact. "We need emergency response teams here now. They're about to deliberately contaminate a major groundwater source." But we'd been so focused on documenting the evidence that we missed the sound of vehicles approaching until it was too late. Headlights swept the area. Margaret Chen's voice cut through the darkness. "Well, this is unfortunate. You really shouldn't be here." She stepped into view, flanked by security guards. Behind them, men in hazmat suits were unloading equipment from trucks. "You're too late," she said, almost casually. "The process has already begun. By morning, this valley's groundwater will be deemed unsafe for human consumption. Emergency evacuation orders will be issued, and in the confusion," she smiled coldly, Accidents happen. We have proof, I said, holding up my phone. Everything. We just found it's already been uploaded. Photos, videos, documents, all of it. To where? She asked. The same cloud storage that's about to experience a catastrophic server failure? The same email accounts that will be flagged for terrorist activity? The same phones that are about to stop working due to a local cell tower outage? On cue, our phones lost signal. They'd thought of everything, but they hadn't thought of Bob Miller. While we were investigating the mine shaft, he'd been parked on a ridge overlooking our farm, broadcasting everything live through a satellite uplink to Sarah's newspaper. Every word Chen had just spoken was being recorded and transmitted, beyond their reach. And they hadn't thought of Deputy Mike Reeves, who'd quietly called in state environmental officers as soon as he spotted the hazmat trucks heading toward our property. Even now, they were surrounding the area. Most importantly, they hadn't thought of Mrs. Henderson. During the video call, she'd noticed something in Kessler's portfolio, a list of offshore accounts where they'd hidden money from previous Protocol Phoenix operations. She'd already sent it to federal prosecutors. We heard sirens in the distance. Chen's face tightened as she realized something was wrong. The hazmat team stopped unloading their equipment, looking uncertainly at their supervisors. Last chance, I said to Chen. How many people were you willing to poison just to hide your crimes? How many lives were you willing to destroy to protect your profits? The whole country is about to know exactly what you tried to do here. She opened her mouth to respond, but was cut off by a new voice, sharp, authoritative, carrying through a megaphone. This is the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division. The area is surrounded. Everyone present is ordered to freeze and put their hands where we can see them. Floodlights suddenly illuminated the scene from all directions. EPA agents in tactical gear emerged from the darkness, weapons drawn. State environmental officers moved in from another direction, and leading them was Catherine, holding an emergency federal injunction. Margaret Chen, she announced formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism, among other charges. I'd read you the full list, but we'll be here all night. As Chen was led away in handcuffs, we could see more vehicles arriving. FBI, state police, even national news vans. The 30-year conspiracy was finally being dragged into the light, but our relief was tempered by urgency. We still needed to check those tanks, ensure nothing had already been released into the aquifer. The valley's future literally hung in the balance. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of federal agents, environmental testing, and breaking news stories. EPA hazmat teams confirmed our worst fears. The tanks at the mine shaft contained industrial chemicals capable of contaminating the aquifer for decades. If Chen's team had succeeded in their plan, they would have poisoned the water supply for thousands of people. The story exploded across national media. Sarah's exposé ran as a front-page special report, detailing not just our valley's story, but similar schemes Riverside had attempted across the country. Other journalists began uncovering identical patterns in different states: fake HOAs, forced sales, environmental manipulation. But the biggest breaks came from unexpected sources. Richard Kessler's wife, already planning her divorce, decided to turn state's evidence. She arrived at the FBI field office with a treasure trove of documents she'd been gathering for years. Richard talked in his sleep, she told investigators. After his father died, he'd have nightmares, mumbling about what they made him do. I started keeping records, just in case. When I saw them setting up the same scheme here in Montana, I knew it was time. Her evidence was damning. She had recordings of board meetings where they openly discussed using environmental crises to force land sales. She had emails about bribing officials, forging documents, and silencing whistleblowers. Most importantly, she had proof connecting Riverside to multiple suspicious deaths, including Robert Kessler's accident and Thomas Walker's heart attack. The dominoes started falling. Benjamin Drake, seeing which way the wind was blowing, offered a full confession in exchange for leniency. He provided details about how they'd manipulated county records, created backdated documents, and coordinated with corrupt officials in multiple jurisdictions. It was all Margaret Chen's idea, he revealed during his FBI interview. She saw how much money could be made controlling water rights during a drought. The rare earth minerals were just a bonus. She approached Riverside, convinced them to back her plan. They provided the money and connections, she handled the local details. The corrupt appeals court judge who'd helped them was caught trying to flee the country. Federal marshals arrested him at a private airfield, carrying offshore account documents and a fake passport. His seized phone contained text messages coordinating with Chen about the planned environmental disaster. State investigators seized records from the county offices, finally understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. They found evidence of similar schemes in early stages across Montana, other valleys, other aquifers, other communities marked for destruction. But the most shocking revelation came from Mrs. Henderson's continued analysis of Kessler's portfolio. Hidden in the binding, she found a micro SD card containing encrypted files. When the FBI's cyber unit cracked them, they revealed the existence of Project Legacy, a 50-year plan to control water rights across the entire western United States. They knew climate change would make water increasingly valuable, Sarah explained as she prepared a follow-up story. They were playing the long game, positioning themselves to control water access across multiple states. What they did here, in our valley, was just a test run, a prototype for something much bigger. The federal response was massive. The EPA launched a comprehensive review of all Riverside's properties, searching for other planned contamination sites. The FBI created a special task force to investigate similar land grab schemes nationwide. The Securities and Exchange Commission suspended trading of Riverside stock, pending a full fraud investigation. State authorities weren't far behind. The governor announced a special commission to review all HOA registrations and water rights transfers from the past 30 years. The state attorney general's office began criminal proceedings against everyone involved in the conspiracy. Local impact was immediate. The appeals court judge's rulings were vacated, including the stay on our case and the shutdown order against our farm. All the fake HOA claims were invalidated. Property owners who'd been forced to sell under fraudulent pressure were given the right to reclaim their land. But justice moved beyond just criminal charges. Federal prosecutors filed civil RICO cases against Riverside and its executives, seeking to seize all assets connected to their schemes. The EPA demanded billions in environmental remediation funds. Class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of every farmer and landowner they'd targeted. Catherine's phone rang constantly with new developments. They're finding similar operations in Idaho, Wyoming, Nevada, she told us during a brief break. Between meetings, this is becoming one of the largest environmental crime cases in U.S. history. Richard Kessler himself finally broke his silence, offering to cooperate fully with prosecutors. His video testimony, this time without any off-camera coercion, laid bare the entire 30-year conspiracy. He provided details about shell companies, secret accounts, and the real reason his father died. Dad discovered the truth about the aquifer contamination plan, he admitted. He was going to expose everything. Chen said they'd handle it. The next day, his brake lines failed on Mountain Road. As federal agents led more conspirators away in handcuffs, we began to understand the true scope of what we'd uncovered. This wasn't just about saving our farm or even our valley. We'd exposed a massive criminal enterprise that had threatened the water security of the entire region. But even as justice began to unfold, we knew the fight wasn't over. There would be appeals, legal challenges, and attempts to hide assets. More importantly, there were other Riversides out there, other corporations planning similar schemes. The question now was, how many other communities were facing the same threat, and would they recognize the warning signs before it was too late? The federal trials began 3 months after Chen's arrest. The courthouse in Helena was packed with farmers, environmental activists, and national media. Sarah's expose had turned the case into a symbol of corporate greed versus rural America, and everyone wanted to see justice served. Margaret Chen faced the most serious charges. Beyond the environmental crimes and fraud, she was now indicted for orchestrating 2 murders, Robert Kessler and Thomas Walker. The evidence from Richard Kessler's testimony and his wife's documents was overwhelming. The defendant didn't just attempt to steal land, the federal prosecutor told the jury in his opening statement. She poisoned communities, destroyed families, and killed anyone who threatened to expose her schemes. This wasn't business. This was organized crime, wearing a corporate mask. Chen's expensive legal team tried everything. They claimed she was just following corporate policy. They argued the HOAs were legitimate and the environmental plans were standard development procedures. They even tried to paint her as a scapegoat for higher-level Riverside executives. But they couldn't explain away the evidence. The VHS tapes showing her pressuring Jack Murphy, the forged documents in the county records, the tanks of chemicals ready to poison the aquifer, and most damningly, her own words captured on Deputy Reeves's body camera and Bob Miller's satellite broadcast. The jury took just 6 hours to reach their verdict. Chen was found guilty on all counts, including 2 charges of first-degree murder. The judge, citing the decades-long nature of her crimes and the potential environmental catastrophe she'd planned, sentenced her to life in prison without parole. Richard Kessler, in exchange for his cooperation, received a lighter sentence, 20 years with the possibility of parole. Benjamin Drake got 15 years. The corrupt appeals court judge was sentenced to 25 years and ordered to repay every bribe he'd received, but the criminal trials were just the beginning. The civil cases and regulatory actions that followed would reshape environmental law and corporate accountability. Riverside Agricultural Solutions was forced into bankruptcy. Their assets were seized and placed in a trust to compensate victims and fund environmental protection efforts. The EPA used the case to create new regulations protecting aquifers from corporate exploitation. The Department of Justice established a special unit focused on environmental crime conspiracies. State legislatures across the West passed laws requiring strict oversight of water rights transfers and HOA formations. For our valley, the impact was immediate and profound. The fake HOAs were dissolved. Families who'd lost their land were given the opportunity to reclaim their properties with compensation for their losses. The Environmental Protection Trust, established from Riverside's seized assets, would ensure the aquifer remained protected for generations. Mrs. Henderson finally came out of protective custody to testify at Chen's sentencing. Her careful documentation and brave decision to hide evidence had been crucial to exposing the truth. The judge specially commended her service to justice. "You showed us that one person with a conscience can defeat even the most powerful conspiracy," he told her from the bench. "Your dedication to truth protected countless lives and communities." Bob Miller got his dairy farm back, along with funding to modernize his operation. The Rodriguez family returned to their orchard. The Patels rebuilt their vegetable farm. One by one, families returned, healing the wounds Chen and Riverside had inflicted on our community. We also learned more about Jack and Linda Murphy's role in protecting the valley. The VHS tapes revealed how they'd quietly gathered evidence for years, knowing someday it would be needed. Their foresight and courage had given us the tools to fight back just when we needed them most. The Federal Environmental Trust established a scholarship in Linda's name, supporting students studying environmental protection and agricultural sustainability. The old mine shaft was properly sealed and converted into a monitoring station to protect the aquifer. Signs marking the Linda Murphy Memorial Aquifer Protection Site now stand where Chen had planned to release her poison. As for our farm, we didn't just survive, we thrived. The publicity from the case brought attention to the importance of family farms and water conservation. We partnered with agricultural researchers to develop drought-resistant farming techniques, sharing our knowledge with other communities facing similar pressures. Deputy Mike Reeves was promoted to sheriff, running on a platform of environmental protection and community policing. His first act was to establish a special unit dedicated to investigating corporate fraud and environmental crimes, ensuring nothing like Chen's conspiracy could ever threaten our valley again. Sarah's reporting won multiple awards, including a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism. More importantly, her stories sparked similar investigations across the country, exposing and preventing other corporate schemes targeting rural communities. The final piece of justice came 1 year after Chen's conviction. During a prison interview, she finally revealed the full scope of Project Legacy. Dozens of similar operations planned across the western states, all now exposed and stopped before they could begin. "We thought time was our weapon," she told investigators. "We never imagined time would be what exposed us. 30 years wasn't long enough to bury the truth. It was long enough for the truth to grow roots and break through every lie we'd built." 5 years have passed since Chen's conviction, and our valley has changed in ways we never expected. The land has healed, families have returned, and a new generation is learning the importance of protecting what matters most. Our farm still stands, stronger than ever. The wheat fields still turn golden every August, but now they're part of something bigger. We've become a training center for sustainable agriculture, teaching other farming communities how to recognize and fight back against corporate land grabs and environmental exploitation. The old barn where we found Linda's journals has been transformed into an educational center. School groups come to learn about water conservation and environmental protection. The wall displays tell the story of our fight, featuring photos of Jack and Linda Murphy, Mrs. Henderson, and all the others who helped save our valley. James still practices law, but now he specializes in helping rural communities protect themselves from corporate takeovers. He's developed a network of lawyers across the country who share information about suspicious land deals and HOA formations. They've stopped at least dozen schemes similar to Chen's before they could take root. Catherine's work on our case led to new federal legislation, the Rural Environmental Protection Act, nicknamed Murphy's Law after Jack and Linda. It provides special protections for agricultural communities and makes it harder for corporations to manipulate water rights or create fake HOAs. Bob Miller's dairy farm has become a model of sustainable agriculture. He works with university researchers to develop water-efficient farming methods, sharing his knowledge freely with other farmers. The community that came together to harvest our wheat in the dark now works together in the light, sharing resources and standing united against any threats to their way of life. Mrs. Henderson retired properly this time, but not before training a new generation of county clerks to spot suspicious document patterns. She still visits sometimes, helping us organize. "The archives of evidence we've collected never stop documenting," she tells everyone. "The truth needs guardians." Sarah's reporting didn't stop with our story. She created a dedicated investigative unit focusing on environmental crimes and corporate fraud in rural America. Her team has exposed similar conspiracies across the country, giving communities the information they need to protect themselves. Deputy Reeves, Now, Sheriff Reeves has made our county a model for rural law enforcement. His Environmental Crimes Unit works closely with federal agencies, ensuring that no corporation can ever again use local officials to facilitate their schemes. The aquifer flows clean and protected, carefully monitored by the Linda Murphy Memorial Research Station. Scientists study our water conservation methods, developing new ways to help farming communities survive in a changing climate without falling prey to corporate exploitation. As for our family, we've grown stronger through all of this. Dad still works the fields, teaching a new generation the value of working the land. Mum's garden has expanded into a community project, bringing neighbors together to grow food and share stories. My brothers and their families have moved back to help run the farm, ensuring our legacy continues. Chen serves her life sentence in federal prison, her empire dismantled, her schemes exposed. Richard Kessler, halfway through his sentence, has become a key witness in other environmental crime cases, helping prosecutors understand how corporations target vulnerable communities. The fake HOA documents that started all this sit in a special exhibit at the State Museum, a reminder of how greed and corruption nearly destroyed our valley. Next to them are Linda's journals, Jack's VHS tapes, and Mrs. Henderson's careful records, proof that ordinary people armed with truth can defeat even the most powerful conspiracies. Sometimes, when the sun sets over our fields, I think about how close we came to losing everything, not just our farm, but our entire community's future. I think about Jack and Linda Murphy, who spent years gathering evidence they knew would be needed someday. About Mrs. Henderson, who risked everything to protect the truth. About Bob Miller and all our neighbors who came together in the dark to save our harvest. They say time reveals all truths, but that's not quite right. Time alone doesn't expose corruption or stop injustice. It takes people willing to watch, to document, to remember, to fight. It takes communities willing to stand together against overwhelming odds. It takes courage to believe that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way to the light. Our valley's story isn't just about saving a farm or stopping a conspiracy. It's about the power of community, the importance of vigilance, and the strength that comes from fighting for what's right. It's about understanding that some things, like clean water, honest government, and the bonds between neighbors, are worth any sacrifice to protect. The wheat still grows, the water still flows, and our community still stands together. And if anyone ever tries to threaten that again, they'll find us ready, because we learned the most important lesson of all. The truth doesn't just set you free, it gives you the strength to stay free. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.